Today, I'm talking to economist Harshal Chitale about the lack of affordable housing in this country. So, Harshal, welcome to the show. Welcome to Namaste New Zealand. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I recently read that New Zealand, well, in the eyes of the IMF, is one of the most unaffordable places for housing, to purchase houses. How do you think that actually affects our immigrant communities, particularly the Indian communities in New Zealand?
It is true that Auckland in particular is probably one of the most unaffordable markets in the world. So if you think about house prices, the median house price in Auckland is probably about $850,000, whereas the median family income is only about $100,000. So if you think about that ratio, houses are about 8.5 times size of an annual household income, which is one of the most severely unaffordable markets in the world. And obviously, it does affect people, because if you think about people, especially immigrant communities who are trying to start a new life, look for good opportunities, one of the key basic needs for them is a good roof over their heads. And home ownership gives you that sense of belonging to the community as well, and you start to feel a little more involved in local society.
In terms of cultural context, I mean, a lot of people from the immigrant communities come from parts of the world where home ownership isn't such a great thing to aspire towards. But that's obviously a very, very distinct qualifying factor of life in New Zealand.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, if you think about New Zealand, we've got plenty of land and the population density is not that high. So there's plenty of land for everybody. In terms of that cultural shift, there's actually another reason why home ownership can be quite a big factor in New Zealand. And that's the fact that if you think about sort of your life cycle, as people age and they start to get closer to retirement, a lot of their financial security comes from having no more rental payments to give out during the retirement. And so home ownership does become quite important. If you're mortgage free by your retirement age, then you can enjoy your retired phase of life as well, because the state provides for a lot of other services. And so home ownership does really become an important asset for your life cycle overall.
So what do you think is the solution to this going forward? I mean, how do we make housing more affordable for, people that have lived here for generations, as well as the newer immigrants coming into the country?
So the solutions really lie in understanding what forces led to the situation and what then we can do about these forces. In the case of housing, there's an additional factor, which is the financing of it. People don't pay cash down for their house. They borrow from a bank. Typically, it's a long-term loan for about 30 years. And you make repayments which are determined by the interest rates of the day. So if you think about what's actually happened to interest rates over the last 10 years, we had the global financial crisis about 2007, 2008. Interest rates were about 9 or 10%. If you talk to a generation that's come before us, 1970s, 1980s, interest rates were 18, 19, 17%. And if you look at today's market, you can get a mortgage if you have reasonable credit history for about 4%. What does that do in a market when also what's happened in Auckland over the last 6 years is the city has gone from about a population of 1.3 million to a population of about 1.7 million. That's 400,000 people added over 7 or 8 years. Even if they don't have the dream of owning a home, they need to be accommodated somewhere. So it puts pressure either on house prices or on rents or both. And so demand has been growing really strongly, but supply has not managed to keep up. Now, there's several factors for why supply might not keep up. Firstly, your construction industry needs to have the flexibility and the capacity to expand output when demand rises all of a sudden. It is a small country. It is a small pool of labor resources. We often compete with Australia in terms of labor market. So when things are good in Australia, Kiwis move over to Australia to work in those markets over there, in the construction sector included. And so we're competing for that supply sort of capacity here. Added to that is some sort of regulations around how land is used. So if you think about how Auckland land is used, there's sort of zoning regulations that Auckland Council puts in place. Now, if you think about what happened in 2015, there was an Auckland Unitary Plan that was signed off, and that's actually added a whole lot of developable capacity to Auckland. And so that's actually starting to deliver much more sort of land that is possible to build on. But that still doesn't solve some of the other constraints in terms of rapidly expanding output. And if you think about what's happened in the last 2 years in the construction sector more broadly, commercial construction is booming. So if you look around in Auckland, you've got massive infrastructure projects. You've got the City Rail link going on. You've got Commercial Bay, which is a 45-foot tower. All these are resource hungry. They suck up resources of the construction sector. So the housing sector is also competing for these resources and capacity with the broader economy.
That's right. Coming back to the Indian communities of New Zealand, you see a few sort of really interesting examples of people that have ended up owning not just one home, but multiple homes. Is there a particular typecast of, say, a household or a family, or even for that matter, a person within this community that you think really makes it to that extent in terms of not just owning one home, but making investments in multiple homes?
I would like to hazard a guess about sort of the stereotype of who makes it and who doesn't in terms of the sort of property market success. But I mean, people who sort of have reasonable amount of skills and an income that can support sort of your initial entry into the housing market. It's also a timing issue, right? So if house prices are sort of 800,000 today, it'll be much harder for a young entrant to the housing market today to rack up a portfolio of 10 properties. Although interest rates are low, your deposit requirement is still quite high. So to get into your first home, you might still need a 20% deposit. 20% of 800,000 is $160,000. How many young people starting off in life at the age of 30, 32 have that kind of cash to splurge on a house? If I were to hazard a guess, it'll be much harder today given how difficult it is to access the housing market today. People from a generation ago, they may have sort of started off early at the right time and built up a portfolio over time through prudent investment. So I wouldn't put a stereotype around it. There's some people who probably sacrifice a lot to build that portfolio. And I think you need to have sort of stable, skilled jobs and have that level of income to fund sort of a consistent repayment stream. So I wouldn't put a stereotype, but there's people who've been successful doing it. And there's no reason why people can't be successful in the future as well.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Harshal. Superb talking to you.
No problem. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
This program was made with the support of New Zealand On Air.